Criminal lawyers. Who's the craziest client you've ever worked with? I'm a lawyer. More specifically, I'm a defense attorney. I represent both criminals and innocent people. Most of the criminals I defend aren't James Bond villains or George Clooney from the Ocean's movies. The majority are just plain stupid. If they weren't, they wouldn't need a lawyer because they wouldn't get caught. Most of the time, I can tell whether my client committed the crime or not. Sometimes they even tell me directly. One day, I got a call from a mother asking me to represent her son. She gave me a summary of the charges and what she knew. I told her I could take the case. When I met her son for the first time, I immediately knew he was guilty. I can't give you the details of the case, but what matters is that this guy wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. He was practically caught red-handed while committing the crime. The prosecution wanted to give him 48 months. I negotiated it down to 36. I urged this guy to take the deal. It was the best he was going to get since he was caught on high-definition security footage. He refused to take the deal. He must have been watching legal dramas every day because he cited legal documents that had no relevance to his case in an attempt to justify going to trial. He thought he was a genius. In reality, this guy had barely graduated high school and had the literacy of an 8th grader. Every meeting I had with him ended with me begging him to take the deal. He would always refuse and say he had to go see his girlfriend. His favorite phrase was, "We have to fight this," but we didn't have to fight anything. After a few pointless meetings, I decided to stop trying to reason with him. We went to trial. I'm a good lawyer, but I'm not Jesus. I'm not in the miracle business. The jury found my client guilty on all counts. No surprise. The real shock came during sentencing. When he was declared guilty, my client gave me the meanest death glare I've ever received. I think, somehow, he felt betrayed by me, even though I had begged this idiot to take the deal. On sentencing day, his usual support group was there. His mom, his brother, and his sister. His girlfriend and aunt had also been present during the trial. But there were 3 new guys I'd never seen before. I'd seen this play out before. My guess was that defendants would call a few friends to try and intimidate the judge and get a lighter sentence. Stupid. I didn't think much of it. Everything proceeded as usual in the courtroom until I heard a commotion coming from the hallway outside. It sounded like a muffled scream at first, something insignificant. But as the noise grew louder, the judge had to stop mid-sentence and ask the bailiff to investigate what was going on. As soon as the judge interrupted the hearing to ask the bailiff to investigate the commotion in the hallway, something inside me stirred uneasily. It wasn't the first time I'd witnessed a disruption in a courtroom, but this time, something felt different. The noise, which initially sounded like a distant ruckus, was growing louder, sharper, and more charged with tension. The bailiff left in a hurry, leaving the courtroom in an uncomfortable silence. Everyone present, the judge, the jury, the attorneys, and the spectators, exchanged confused glances. I turned to look at my client. He sat there, completely still, with an expression that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't fear or anger. It was calm, almost satisfaction. A few minutes passed, and the silence was broken when the bailiff returned, visibly shaken. He approached the judge and whispered something in his ear. The judge frowned, clearly displeased. "We're taking a 10-minute recess," he announced, banging his gavel. People began to rise, murmuring among themselves, while I tried to process what was happening. I decided to take the opportunity to find out. I approached the bailiff, who stood near the door, still catching his breath. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "There seems to have been a fight in the hallway," he replied hesitantly. "But that's not all. There are reports someone's been injured. We're trying to figure it out." None of this made sense. Fights in courthouses weren't unheard of, especially involving emotional family members. But something serious enough to halt a trial? That was rare. I returned to my seat, trying to calm the unease building inside me. My client was watching me with an enigmatic smile. I decided to confront him. "What's going on here?" I whispered firmly. He leaned forward, still smiling. "Just wait, counselor. It's about to get interesting." Before I could push further, the judge returned to the room, accompanied by 2 police officers. One of them was holding a radio, seemingly in constant communication with someone outside. "We'll continue with the proceedings," the judge announced, trying to regain control. But before he could proceed, the courtroom door burst open, and 2 more officers entered, visibly alarmed. One of them approached the judge and whispered something in his ear. The judge, who had been composed up until then, now looked unsettled. "This court is adjourned until further notice," he declared as the officers began to escort everyone out. Confusion spread through the room. People started asking questions, murmuring, standing up. I went back to the bailiff, demanding answers. What's happening now? He looked at me nervously. There seems to have been a break-in. We're not entirely sure, but someone managed to access the evidence room. The evidence room? Why? Yes, it's serious. Reports suggest some files were stolen. My heart began to race. I turned to my client, who was still sitting calmly at the bench, as if nothing had happened. I approached him again, this time disregarding all protocol. What did you do? I asked in a low, intense tone. He looked at me with bright eyes, full of a calculating intelligence I hadn't noticed before. Nothing you can prove, counselor. At that moment, everything became clear. His trial wasn't the focus. It was a distraction, and I, unknowingly, had been a part of it. The case we were trying involved a series of robberies in commercial establishments. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, recovered items, even eyewitnesses. I convinced myself he was just another impulsive thief who thought he could outsmart the system. But now everything fit. The commotion in the hallway, the break-in at the evidence room, the unfamiliar faces in the courtroom that day. It all was part of a meticulously orchestrated plan. I needed answers. I requested a private meeting with him at the prison. When we met in the visitation room, he looked even more satisfied than before. So, counselor, did you enjoy the show? It was you. All of it. It wasn't a question. Let's just say I was a pawn on the chessboard. He leaned forward, staring me directly in the eyes. Did you really think this was about a petty theft? What are you saying? He laughed, a cold, calculated sound. The robbery, the trial, the deal I refused, it was all part of the plan. While you were busy trying to save me, my friends were ensuring that certain information disappeared. Information? Let's just say the evidence against me and others involved in less-than-legal ventures is no longer a problem. I didn't know what to say. He'd used his own trial as theater to distract everyone while achieving something much bigger. They'll catch you, he shrugged, still smiling. Maybe, but by then, the work will be done. I left that prison with a weight on my chest. He wasn't the fool I thought he was. He was a calculating genius, willing to sacrifice his freedom to achieve a greater goal. And worst of all, I had been just another pawn in his game. I left the prison that night with my head spinning. Every detail of the day felt like a piece of a puzzle I could barely begin to assemble. My client wasn't just a calculating genius. There was something more, something deeply unsettling about him. He was the kind of person who could manipulate situations and people as if they were mere puppets. But why? What was his ultimate goal? The answer began to reveal itself that very night when I received a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering. "Good evening, counselor," said a deep, cold voice on the other end of the line. I recognized the voice immediately. It was him. "How did you manage to call?" I asked, try to keep calm. He chuckled softly, as if my question amused him. "I have my ways, but that's not why I'm calling. I want to clarify a few things. What do you want? You already got what you wanted, didn't you? You created chaos in the courtroom, stole the files. What more could you possibly need? Do you think this is the end?" He laughed again, but this time with a menacing tone. This was just the beginning. A chill ran down my spine. "Listen, if this is a threat, He interrupted before I could finish. "It's not a threat, counselor. It's a certainty. You're involved in something far bigger than you can understand. And now that you've defended me, you're part of it." "Part of what?" I asked, my patience thinning. "Part of a game that started long before you even knew my name." There was a momentary silence, as if he were deliberately building suspense. "Do you know why I was arrested, counselor?" He continued. "The thefts, the petty crimes they accuse me of, it was all theater." "Theater?" I asked, incredulous. "Are you saying you let yourself get arrested on purpose?" "Exactly. It was necessary. The judicial system is the perfect place to make things disappear that shouldn't be found. But you know that already, don't you?" I thought back to the evidence room heist, the commotion in the hallway, how he had orchestrated every step of the process. But something still didn't add up. "Why all of this?" I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "What's your goal?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Don't you see it yet? I'm not your average criminal. I'm what some call a fixer." "A fixer?" "Yes. Corporations, politicians, even governments come to me when they need something done, something that can't be traced. When I was arrested, I was solving a problem for a client. Unfortunately, my success attracted enemies. I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. Are you saying all of this was part of a plan? Including me?" "Of course, counselor. You were the perfect pawn. An ethical, diligent lawyer. Someone who always plays by the rules. I needed you to lend credibility to the process, to ensure no one suspected this was all staged. My mind was spinning. He had used my reputation as a shield, manipulating me the entire time. And now, what happens to me? He laughed again, but this time the sound was even colder. That depends on you. You can go on living your life as if nothing happened, or you can stick your nose where it doesn't belong and face the consequences. That's it? You're threatening me? It's not a threat, counselor. It's a warning. There are people far more dangerous than me involved in this. People who wouldn't hesitate to ensure your silence in ways you'd prefer to avoid. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I spent the night wide awake, replaying every word, every detail of the case in my mind. There was no doubt that he was far more than he appeared to be. He operated in the shadows, manipulating entire systems to achieve his goals. But why? The answers began to surface in the days that followed. I received an anonymous envelope at my office. Inside were documents detailing illegal financial transactions, connections to politicians, and multinational corporations. Everything pointed to a massive corruption and money laundering scheme, with him at the center of it all. But what truly terrified me was a photo included with the documents. It was a picture of me, taken the same night he had called. The message was clear. I was being watched. Suddenly, I understood what he meant when he said I was now part of this. He didn't need me to cooperate. He just needed me to stay silent. I spent weeks living in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the moment when they would decide I was no longer useful. Then one day, I received another call. "Counselor, I hope you're taking care of yourself. What do you want now?" Just a reminder that silence is golden. You did good work, and I value that. But remember, the moment you think about doing something reckless, there will be consequences. Before I could respond, he hung up, and that was it. I never heard from him again, but the scars from that experience have never healed. He wasn't just crazy. He was the kind of person who operates on a level most of us can't even comprehend. Moving pieces on the board of a game, he always seems to win. Now, I live in constant vigilance, knowing that somewhere out there, he's still pulling strings, manipulating everything and everyone. And worst of all, knowing that in some way, I helped him do it. After that last call, my curiosity turned into a silent obsession. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened during and after the trial. Something didn't add up. His case had been solid from the start. Overwhelming evidence, video footage, witness testimonies, and yet after the chaos in the courtroom, everything simply vanished. At first, I thought it was just a delay in the system. Courts are often slow and disorganized, especially with cases so straightforward. But days turned into weeks, and then months, and there was no news of a new trial, no appeals, nothing. His name disappeared from any legal mention, as if he had never existed. I tried to look for answers discreetly, going through court records and talking to colleagues. Nobody seemed to have any concrete information about what had happened. The only lead came from a cryptic comment by a court clerk who whispered that the judge from the case had taken an indefinite leave shortly after the hearing was suspended. That made me even more uneasy. An indefinite leave? What could have happened for an experienced judge to suddenly abandon their post like that? My mind started forming theories. Had the judge been threatened? Had powerful people intervened to ensure the case didn't go forward? The way everything disappeared from the records suggested something much deeper. Cleaners, as I'd learned from my research, didn't just eliminate physical evidence. They also manipulated entire systems, erased trails, and silenced anyone who might become a problem. I remember my client's unnerving calm throughout the trial. Even with all the evidence stacked against him, he never showed panic or concern. On the contrary, he seemed like someone who already knew how things would end. Had he used his network to intimidate the judge, or worse, to buy their silence? It was impossible to know for sure, but the pieces were starting to fit. The commotion during the hearing, the theft of the evidence, the trial suspension, and the judge's sudden leave, all pointed to larger forces working behind the scenes. And I, unknowingly, had been just another tool in his plan. For weeks, I wrestled with the idea of digging deeper or letting it go. But every time I thought about investigating further, I remembered his warning during the last call. Silence is golden. And more than that, I remembered the photo I'd received. An image of me, taken that very night, a clear reminder that he knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. What would I gain by pursuing this? Justice? Curiosity? None of those options seemed worth the risk of becoming the next obstacle to be eliminated. I had no doubt that he, or the people he worked for, would have no hesitation in ensuring my silence in a more permanent way. I decided to make the safest choice. I closed all the documents and files related to the case, destroyed any trace of my investigations, and promised myself never to mention his name again, not even in my thoughts. Now, every time I think back to those days, I'm filled with a mix of relief and fear. Relief that my involvement in that game ended before it could harm me directly. Fear because I know that somewhere out there, he's still operating in the shadows, manipulating systems and people with terrifying precision. I can't help but wonder if I'll ever cross paths with him again. But one thing is certain. If it happens, it won't be by accident. I'm convinced that if he reappears in my life, it'll be because he's decided I still have something he can use. Or because, in some way, I've become a problem that needs to be eliminated. That's why I chose silence. Not out of cowardice, but because I understood something essential. Sometimes survival depends on knowing when to stay quiet.